Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. I'm not going to talk in detail about the agenda of the conference because that's for the other speakers. Really, my point here, or my role here, is to reflect on the year. I'm probably going to focus on the latter part of the year because I think it's proportionately more important to where we're going. Whenever anyone steps onto a stage like this to deliver any form of address, or steps behind a lectern to deliver any form of address, they will always try to gauge what the audience is thinking. Who wouldn't adopt that approach? I know I certainly do. It's a form of self-preservation. It doesn't mean that I would say anything different. I certainly wouldn't. More that I have a better idea of what to expect following what I say. You have far more power as an audience than I do as an individual speaker, and I'm going to explain why. When considering what you're thinking, this doesn't mean I try to gauge what you're individually thinking. I mean, who would really want to know what some of you are thinking just now? What I really want to do is gauge the mood of the room. The mood of the room can be very, very different to what you're thinking as an individual. It can be quite different. So the mood of you as an audience could be one of expectation. You've come here to conference, you're away from your desk, you could be relieved. You could be looking forward to a night time in the bar. You could have sat through the football last night. The mood of you as an individual can be very different. So as an audience, you could be relaxed. As an individual, you might be concerned as to what the next 2 years might bring, or you might be excited as to what the opportunities that lay ahead. You might be concerned individually as to where a cabinet reshuffle might take us. I know that I certainly am. And you might be concerned as to how that might play out with regards to our political support. You might actually purely be concerned that you can't quite remember how you managed to book yourself onto a field trip that involves cycling. My central point here is that as an audience, your mood can be very, very different to your mood as an individual. For me, it's clearly a case of the whole being far greater than the sum of the parts. And thankfully, from the discussions that we've seen earlier, your mood as an audience seems pretty good. What I want you to do now is to picture an orchestra up here on the stage behind me. I've given you a prompt here. You would have the conductor at the front. He would be communicating with his violins to the left. The trumpets would be at the back. The percussion would be somewhere in the middle towards the back. If you concentrate hard, you might just be able to pick out the playing of the second violinist or an individual flute, but it's much more likely that you will be engrossed in the whole experience. You may be listening to a symphony. It would be very unlikely that you'd be able to pick out the individual tunes coming from the individual instruments. You will be absorbed in the full experience of the interaction between the musicians and the audience, the conductor and the audience, the musicians and the buildings. The whole, in this case, is very, very different to the sum of the parts. We can identify the parts very easily, and actually that's the simplest way of working with it, but the whole is far more powerful and much, much harder to define. I went up to the west coast of Scotland in May for my 50th birthday. I usually downplay my birthday. I tend not to tell many people. But this required much more effort than normal. Whether it was my 50th or people knew about it, I don't know. I'm not sure that I really wanted to be 50, and I don't think I've ever really admitted that to anyone. But I really felt the alternative was far worse, so I was willing to put up with it. So I headed off to Scotland, the Highlands of Scotland, with my wife and 3 dogs, and I'd never been up there before. And I actually loved every minute of it. Those of you that know the Highlands will know the landscape of the Highlands of Scotland is spectacular. It's very impressive. But it wasn't until I reached a stretch of water, the stretch of water that separated Skye from the mainland of Scotland, that I really understood the value of the notion of landscape. Everything I could see before me could be broken down into its constituent parts: the water, the moorland, the woodland, the settlements and so on. But individually, they meant far less than their sum. The interaction and interdependency is what created the landscape, and actually that's what created the wow, that's what created an absolutely stunning impression of what was going on. It is so much greater than the sum of the parts, in the same way that an orchestra is obviously greater than the sum of its parts. And you as an audience are far more powerful as a collective than the sum of you all as individuals. In recent history, we've become obsessed with counting, weighing, predicting, measuring and trading the parts that constitute the whole in so many walks of life. In education, we've taught maths without reference to music, biology without reference to maths. In healthcare, we've treated individual symptoms without looking at wider issues of well-being. We've treated mental health issues on an individual level without actually trying to address issues around broken communities. And our approach to the environment has been similar, with organisations set up to protect birds, to protect trees, to protect heather moorland. The whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. So why have we done this? Because it's easier, that's why. We're on the whole logical, and logic seems to support deconstruction. The consequence of this, I think, has led to a significant loss of resilience. When we talk about our environment and we focus on biodiversity, or planning, or communities, or geodiversity, or ecosystem services, or natural capital, firstly, we can easily focus on some things at the expense of others. But more importantly, we often fail to recognise that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that the parts don't operate in isolation, that they're independent, and actually most things are. As an individual, you might be having a bad day. I've had some interesting discussions over the course of the last few days. But I would hope that the mood of conference will keep you positive and affect your decisions. As an audience, you are all totally interdependent and more powerful for it. A violinist in that orchestra that I mentioned might miss a note, but the symphony is still carried along by the bulk of the audience, and you might barely notice. Bulk of the musicians, sorry, and you might barely notice. And in a coherent landscape, like the landscape I mentioned, a period of sustained heavy rain or drought might have little consequence in the longer term to the species and habitats that constitute it, or the communities that depend upon it. In all these examples, the whole is resilient, despite the performance of an individual component. Building resilience is key to our future. Resilient landscapes, resilient communities, and resilient economies. And by resilience, I don't mean the ability to bounce back or reach a new state of equilibrium. The only constant in any system is change, and resilience is the ability to constantly adapt to sustain development in that system. So what does this all mean for us in practical terms? We've had quite an exciting year so far. Philip mentioned it, even without the results of last week. Our protected budget status in England was quite honestly more than I could have ever hoped for. It came, however, with a clear signal from DEFRA. This grant was an investment in continued change. In Wales, specifically, we've been working much more closely with Welsh Government and the National Park authorities, and really collaborating on the path to a new future under new laws with new aspirations around well-being, and it really feels like we're making progress there. And this year we have Northern Ireland represented here at conference for the first time in quite a few years. This is really, really pleasing, and I think all 3 points are worthy of celebration in themselves. But if resilience is all about adaptation and development, we'll need to be speaking to different people and saying different things, especially in light of cuts across the wider public sector, and more recently Brexit and the decision that was taken last week. A very clear test will be how the group of AONBs and National Park staff, and I use this as an example, working together down in the southwest and the south of England on the Big Chalk project, maintain the momentum around the collaboration that was forming around that particular project. Obviously aimed at European funding, but now it's going to have to change its course slightly. We need to work differently, but we need to maintain momentum. If you are going to be part of the AONB family in 3 years' time, who are the different people you'll be talking to? What are the different things you will be saying? How will you be telling a different story? How will you be exciting new people at the prospect of engaging with you? Our collective challenge is recognising that the AONB family is greater than the sum of its parts, that our collective action, born of sharing ideas and understanding, will yield far more impressive results than our working in isolation. That we mustn't prohibit what we've historically known as failure, as this will absolutely kill innovation, and we need innovation now. And we can only do this by functioning as a resilient whole. If you remember the example I used around an orchestra and a violinist, the violinist that played the bum note, the symphony still continued. We all have problems to resolve, hurdles to overcome in order to adapt and sustain development. Most of us, despite our best intentions, only really ever come up with part of an idea. I don't think Newton actually worked alone to come up with the theories that he came up with. Actually, coming up with ideas looks far more like the slide on the right. Piecing your ideas together with the partial ideas of other people might actually provide us with some sensible, fully formed solutions. Collective action, collaboration, cooperation, we can call it whatever we like. These are just words to describe our journey towards solutions. So in summary, over the next few days, try out your imperfect ideas, even if you feel they're not fully formed. It doesn't actually matter if they're half fully formed, someone else might have the other half. If we all come away agreeing on a few fully formed solutions, then I think conference will have worked. When you leave conference, of equal importance is your commitment to upholding the notion of landscape. It's relevant. We help look after some of the UK's most stunning, precious and cherished landscapes, and we do it in a way that reflects the whole, not the sum of the parts. There are very few people doing this, but it's essential if we're going to achieve any form of resilience and consequent sustainable development. AONBs are absolutely outstanding. There are places where the whole is clearly far greater than the sum of the parts. You, individually, are guardians of the big picture, so please look after it. Thank you.